now listening to The Bryan Callen Show, rated the #1 podcast of all time.
Of all time.
Oh.
Make sure you're ready, because this is the podcast where you are guaranteed to learn virtually everything. Well, today's episode is brought to you by Squarespace, which is an all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website or online portfolio. And for a free trial and 10% off, all you have to do is go to squarespace.com and use the offer code CALLEN8. You know, I always say I won't accept any sponsors that I don't believe in or that I don't use myself. I don't use Squarespace, but my friend does. And I actually watched him create a bunch of really good websites in, I think he created like 5 of them in an hour. It was unbelievable. And they looked incredibly professional. And I'll tell you, if you're not and he's pretty savvy when it comes to, computers and stuff. But if you're not that savvy, the great thing is they have an incredibly easy to use support team. You can get them anytime, 24/7, and they're always there to help. It's $8 a month, which includes a free domain name if you sign up for a year. And they really actually have, I looked at it, they actually have some really cool features and these new designs, and it's really just these incredible style options. And it really allows you to create a very unique website. So I have to say that I am happy that they're sponsoring this, because I actually believe in the product. I think it's excellent, and it's a good example of how technology is making it easier for the everyday layman like myself to have an experience that reaches a lot of people and make it look very professional. And Squarespace is very good at that. So if you want a great website that's very easy to create and costs virtually no money, go to squarespace.com. And if you type in the offer code CALLEN8, you'll get 10% off.
Did it not come through?
No worries. We it's we figured it out. At least we're talking to each other now. That's what matters, my friend. Thanks so much for calling. You're in Australia, I guess.
Yeah, I am. I'm in Sydney. What's the time there?
We're at 5:24 p.m. over here. So we're just excited to have you. Loved your book.
So 5:24 p.m. I always forget. It's sort of such a long. It's weird. What are we now? We're now 10:24. You're such a long way away from us in time terms, aren't you?
I know. Are you? Do you live there? Are you doing research for another book, or what are you doing?
You there?
Yeah. Are you researching a book, or do you live in Australia now?
I actually live in Australia. I'm at Sydney University now. So I was at Cambridge, but I've been at Sydney for about the last 2.5 years or so. It's sort of so it's a kind of slightly weird place to be doing ancient world things, but it's
in the very new world, indeed.
Yeah, no, exactly. New. Well, it gives you a sense of perspective, doesn't it? But it's the strange thing about Australia, especially Sydney, is that they're obsessed with sort of ancient world studies.
Really?
So there's a massive... Yeah, because I don't know why that is. I mean, I'm still trying to get to grips with why that is. But I think it's because they've got so many immigrants from Greece, Lebanon, Italy, like America was. Lots of people came here to escape, whatever else was going on in Europe. And I think also that's that sort of sense in which... there's always this sort of myth that here's sort of terra nullius, the sort of idea that it has no history. And so I think there's been a lot of sort of, bringing in of sort of European history. But the numbers of people you get doing, so for instance, our Greek and Roman courses here, we get 300 people doing it in the first year.
Wow.
You'd never get that in any British or American university, ever.
Well, that brings me to a question, and it's funny because I love the book, by the way, and I thought to myself, I always say to young people, I say, reading history is a very important thing. Well, they say why, and then there are a lot of answers to that, right? It's the study of surprise, it's the study of conflict, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it gives you perspective, and we all know the reasons why. But I thought to myself, why write a book about Carthage? Even though we all know about it, it's funny because it doesn't bear necessarily any relevance in our everyday life. However, I think 95% of the people I know, regardless of their education, knows something about Carthage, knows can imagine what it would be like, or at least the horrors of what it'd be like for a civilization that has stood for 700 years to fall like that. What got you to write about this, and why?
I think for a start, I mean, I think it particularly speaks to North Americans, actually. And I'll tell you why I think this, because the moment ago, I have to say, I've started to write a book on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And so I've been looking at whole ideas of decline, of destruction, etc. And of course, America, and in fact, in some respects, the West, we've been obsessed with the idea of our own decline and destruction, almost from the moment of our sort of creation.
That's very interesting.
Well, if you look at Benjamin Franklin writing about America, saying, within decades of your country sort of getting started, of worrying about its demise.
Well, it's funny because there's a legend that Franklin, when he came out after drafting the Constitution with the founding fathers, and he said, the woman said, "What have you done?" And he said, "What have you created?" or something. And he said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." So you're right. There's always been this idea.
And you got the same sort of thing, and a couple of hundred years later, you've got Charles Dickens visiting America and saying, all they ever talk about is about their own destruction and decline. And Rome was exactly the same. I mean, Rome was also what I call a declinist state. And if you look at the states now, and you think about, if you go back and look over all of the sort of all of these sort of national issues magazines, all the politics magazines, they're just full of people banging on about America's decline. And so, in some respects, and you've had the same thing with the West, with Britain as well, so we are. The reason why Carthage has sort of played such a big part in our sort of collective psyche in the West has been the concept of that it gets destroyed, and that's what it's famous for more than anything else. And so, that sort of moment in which this sort of great civilization is completely obliterated. And, and I suppose why that's important to us to start with is because there goes us, but by the grace of God, that we look and see what can happen.
Right.
So that was where I started, and that's why I wanted to start with the destruction. But then the question is, why? And what was this thing? And I think, I'll give you an example of this. When I made a television program about Carthage many years ago, and I'll never forget turning up in Carthage with this sort of TV director. He was a kind of quite sort of upfront guy, and so we get onto the Bursa Hill, which is the main citadel of Carthage. And he starts freaking out, and he goes, "But there's nothing here." I was going, well, kind of, Dumbo, that's the point. That's why we are here.
That's so funny. And I guess and for people who are listening, it's Carthage is sort of what Tunisia is on the tip of, I guess, what is today Tunisia in North Africa. But when you get there, and we're talking about a civilization and that stood for 700 years. And by the way, and I think if I remember correctly, the wall that sort of you saw from the sea was the blocks of sandstone that were covered in plaster weighed something like 1,300 pounds each or something crazy.
Absolutely enormous blocks. Look. It was basically this incredible city. It was the first big superpower of the Mediterranean. Wow. And why I wanted to write this book was because what tends to happen, what we tend to do is that we want to be seen, if we become great powers ourselves, we don't want to be seen as the sort of, as the person, as the state which is sort of standing on the shoulders of giants. We want to be seen as great in our own, in our own right. And what Rome does is that Rome, in its own ascent to greatness, basically sort of takes over Carthage, takes over the Carthaginian settlements all over the Mediterranean. It takes over Carthage's trade routes. So in some respects, Rome becomes a great economic power through what it learns from Carthage. But at the same time, what it does is it sort of eradicates the memory of Carthage. So in some respects, when we think about the ancient Mediterranean, what do we think about? We think about Greeks and we think about Romans. And we think that the Greeks were the clever guys, were the kind of geeks who basically thought a lot but actually didn't deliver much, whereas the Romans were the sort of go-to guys.
Right.
Of course, that's a sort of terrible cliche, and I'm sure any of your listeners who've any Greek heritage or Roman heritage or Italian heritage sort of jumping up and down.
But you're right. But you're right. When you read Socrates, for example, the tradition that came, the philosophical tradition, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, they sat around thinking of, and this was in the aftermath of a devastating war with the Persians, I believe. So they were a defeated country. And for whatever reason, they had the luxury of sitting around and coming up with these ideas that we still talk about today. So you're right. I mean, the Greeks, you're absolutely right about that.
But I think the thing about the Mediterranean world is the Mediterranean world was basically a rich cultural stew. Mm-hmm. As rich a cultural stew as it is now. And, if you look around, if you look about who we consider to be Mediterranean people, and I use the pejorative sense of we think about people on the northern shores of the Mediterranean, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah. Or on the western shores. We don't tend to think about those people who live on its eastern shores or its southern shores. Mm-hmm. And it is. We're pretty selective, even now, about how we want to view what we consider to be Mediterranean culture.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. You're right about that.
And it's no different in terms of how we've decided to sort of delineate the ancient world too. Mm. And I think what I wanted to do is that I wanted, the more that I looked into basically what Carthage had been and what the Punic world, what we call the Punic world, which is the sort of the adjective as such of Carthaginian and Phoenician settlements across the Mediterranean world, I began to realize just how important it was. And that basically there had been this sort of joined up Mediterranean world long before Rome had, Rome, a time when Rome, I think I said in the book that Rome had basically been Hicksville on the Tiber. At a time when Carthage was kind of at its pomp, and they had settlements all the way from Spain, all the way, in Sardinia, in Sicily, Malta, right, and as well as North Africa. So this really was a sort of, I think what I try to do with the book is quite simple, is that I tried to show that actually the Mediterranean is an even more complex and even more interesting place than we might think.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess part of what you think about with Carthage, or you think about with the fall of Constantinople, for example, or these stories you hear about the sort of falling of an empire. And by the way, it's a little bit different in today's terms, as if the West is declining, quote unquote. Well, my feeling is that it'll be a slow and steady erosion of our national character. So to be an American, well, what's that mean anymore? You've got so many different cultures. It is a cultural stew. It isn't the traditional American, baseball and apple pie as much anymore. There are a lot of different Americans, and that means a whole bunch of different stuff, depending on where you're from, right? We're becoming a Spanish-speaking, almost a bilingual country, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be a different kind of decline. But when I think about, say, Carthage, when they were starving the people and they were dying of, they were starving and they were dying of disease, and finally you get these images in your head of you're trying to protect your family, and these guys come in with swords and they're raping your wife and they're killing your kids, and all at least as a man, I probably think about that once a day, at least. It's literally in my DNA, and it's the reason I do jujitsu and I box. I swear to God, I'm always getting ready. It's so ingrained, and my ancestry, my genetic code must have gone through that many times, because I'm always getting ready. I have an alarm. Yeah.
The NRA are going to love you.
Oh, they sure are. But I even when I talk about it on stand-up, I'm a progressive guy in the sense, but when it comes to gun control in this country, I think, I always say you're going to have a hard time getting people to give up their guns, because the idea is men feel like without a gun they can't protect what they love. It is very, very ingrained in the American.
I think mythology. It's impossible. I think it's in the American psyche. I used to live in the Midwest, in Wisconsin.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah.
And where there are more deer and cows than anything else.
I'm going hunting in Wisconsin on the 21st of November, by by the way, for this TV show.
Oh, well,
I'm shooting deer up there, so there it is.
Yeah, well, that's what everybody does. But I know exactly. And of course, being a European, I just don't have that. Whereas I used to.
You guys paid such a
Florida.
you paid such a price for violence in World War I and World War II. It was played out right in front of you. I think it's a different thing. We still have a bit of a mythology attached to the glory of combat in this country. Yeah. But
to sort of answer your question, look, I think there is. I mean, one of the things I tried to get across in this book also is about quite how brutal and violent the ancient world was. And nothing becomes, and at the same time, so that as I think I say in the book, that 146 BC, Rome doesn't just do it to Carthage. They do exactly the same thing to the city of Corinth, which is one of the most important cities in Greece.
Yeah.
And the thing about both of these situations, especially the Carthage one, is they had a long time to think about it. Mm-hmm. So
they planned it.
It was premeditated.
Yeah. And it makes it's so sinister. The sort of idea that you decide that you're going to sort of deliver this sort of final solution on one of your great enemies. And the fact of it is that by this time, Carthage wasn't even a big threat to Rome. It had passed. I mean, Carthage by this time was a shadow of its former self. Mm-hmm. So in other words, what you're getting, what I say in the book is this, is what I call the economy of terror. Now, these days, you can make threats, and we rarely have to make good on these threats. What Rome does is that Rome delivers two resounding sort of warnings to the rest of the world with Carthage and with Corinth. And they say, look, what we want you to see is the worst case scenario of what happens to you if you continually try and resist us.
I mean, it's literally the nuclear option. It's literally extermination. When in the way in the book, the way you describe when they're using, I guess, metal hooks to clear the path and throwing the living and the dead into ditches, and it's just, and women and children and those that did survive, or those that when the elders came with their olive branches, they essentially took 50,000 of them and sold them into slavery.
Yeah, and then look, that was your lot.
Wow.
It's winner takes all. There's no, there are no sort of good outcomes. If you lose in the ancient world, you lose, and you lose big.
Yeah, you lose big.
We don't have any, and I think one of the things, and I know it's a bit of an old cliche now. I mean, everyone's banging on about drones all the time. There's some fat guy somewhere in Washington, on his computer screen eating burgers, blowing up jihadis and stuff like that, in their Land Cruisers. And we've become so detached from the whole concept of killing, and that's what all modern weaponry does. And so, therefore, I think one of the things I also wanted to get across was the sense in which, with Carthage, these Romans had to kill everybody by hand.
That's what I was thinking myself. I thought to myself, the smell of it.
And to kill somebody by hand without getting too macabre, killing somebody by hand is not easy.
No, no.
You might get lucky with one shot, in the heart zone, but actually, on the whole, it is not easy. And so, therefore, just this whole, I wanted to get across this sort of apocalyptic sort of vision of trying to give the readers just a sense of what that might, even though I can barely imagine, what that might possibly be like. Because we are so removed from that world now.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sure if we were living in Syria or somewhere like Iraq or somewhere like that, we would unfortunately be less removed from that world. But we are, if I'm sitting in Sydney, you're sitting in. Are you in LA?
Yeah. Thank God. By the way,
both of us. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I'm in the Southern Hemisphere's version of LA. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I kept thinking about. As I read the book, I kept thinking about what it sounded like, what the wailing, and what it sounded like as Carthage fell, as these men came in with their hatchets and their swords, what it smelled like, and there was this clinical, visceral sort of feeling that the book conveys. I thought to myself, it must have been, just one of Dante's rings, man. You think about how horrific it must have been, and like you said, it took 6 days as they went through the streets and they rotated. They had to rotate their troops because killing gets exhausting. Obviously,
it's a lot of shoulder strain.
Look, and it's just mentally more than anything else. I mean, there was something. I had to do this course for the BBC once, which was, I've made a few sort of TV documentaries for the BBC, and one of them, I did this one called Ancient Worlds, and this was about 2009, 10, and we were going to go to Iraq, we're going to Basra, and we're going to Baghdad, going to Pakistan, and a few other places. And so if you go to all those sort of places, they make you do this course. And one of the things that they really try and get into is just how difficult it is to kill another human being. And how few of us are actually mentally able to really do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so therefore, one of the things again in the book is that, of course, it's difficult not to be anachronistic. And I read tons of sort of more popular books, and you think, come on, mate, all you're doing, this is very anachronistic. Actually, this is not the way people in the ancient world would try and think. But as I said, just to go back to this point, I've really tried to get a sense of trying to get people to sort of engage with the horror of an ancient battle scene, because otherwise you sometimes read these books. I obviously had to read a lot of books about the Punic Wars, and often, please, if there are any military historians out there, I apologise now. Don't come and get me. But sometimes you see these things, and they've got all these diagrams of saying, and then the cavalry charged here, and I'm not a military historian, but I'm interested in war, but I'm interested in its consequences
and the human
its emotional
dimension.
consequences, and I'd often get no sense of that, as if it had been. You get these sort of slightly sort of this sense of it just being a sort of a game. Yeah, and I didn't want. Yeah. I wanted to get a sense of of how sort of down and dirty it is.
Oh, you do that so well in the book. It really I was almost like, let's turn this into a movie, man. This is like
Great. Well, look, if there's anyone out there.
Yeah. Hey, we're in Los Angeles, baby. Let's see. Yeah. But again, to really capture. See, we have this tendency. You read about the Mongols, or you read about, and history's full of this, right? An army comes over the hill, and you're tending to your goats, and you look up and just see a dust cloud, and it's just a bunch of barbarians on a horse. And you think to yourself, well, yeah, it must have been bad. Was it really that bad? I mean, would they really come in and just kill a bunch of children and things like that? You really only have to look 60 years, even less than that. What am I thinking about? You can go to Rwanda or any of these places, and you realize how horrible it really was. And it's hard to imagine that everything you've known and a city that stood for 700 years. I mean, if you weren't dead, you then were sold into slavery. What did that mean? What do we know about that? What did it mean to say, here's 50,000 people, you're going to funnel through this hole in a wall, and we're going to sell you to slavery? What did that mean? If you're a woman, if you got 2 kids in your arms, what does that mean?
I think the first thing to say is this is about economics as well. I mean, Rome during this period, as soon as you get, why does anybody have an empire? We dress it up in all sorts of sort of ways later on. With hindsight, we say, like the British Empire, they had that poet Rudyard Kipling who said, "Oh, it's all about the white man's burden. We've got to go out there, we've got to conquer you, we've got to sell you, slavery, steal everything to civilize you."
I never met an Indian man who liked.
Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, never met an Indian man who liked Kipling.
It's just obviously it's complete bull, but. In the end, what it's down to is because we're trying to get our hands on resources, and humans are resources as much as anything else. And one of the things you look at with Rome is that once it takes over, once it destroys Carthage, once it conquers Greece, the elite of Rome become colossally rich. Mm-hmm. And slaves are part of that thing. Well, what you do? Well, firstly, what you do is you take away all their land and you create these huge estates. And then what you do is you need cheap workers. You need people to actually work on these estates, and so you get slaves. I think one of our problems is that I think the ancient world mentally for us has never been so far away, for all sorts of different reasons. But I think one of the things to get across is this is a much tougher, shorter life than the mollycoddled lives that we have now. You said, how could anyone kill children? And well, think about it. In this period, 40% of children were dead before their second birthday.
Well, there were no vaccines. There were no vaccines. There was no antibiotics. So your attitude towards life and who is going to live is going to be totally different from ours. Now we're incredibly sentimental about this. And also, think about it in terms of when did we start becoming incredibly emotional in terms of and sort of sanctifying children in terms of, well, that's quite a modern phenomenon too. Amazing.
So what I would say is this is a shorter, more brutal, a much more dangerous life than the one we have now. And one can only imagine that, for us it's very difficult to grasp, but if you lived in that world, then you'd probably make very different assumptions than the ones that we do.
Well, and one of the
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, actually. It makes it, and as you put it into that context, it actually makes it a bit more bearable. I suppose you were always waiting for the other foot to drop. You were always, every single day was like, this is, I've talked to soldiers in combat, elite commandos and things, and a lot of times the way they get through the stress of it is they just kind of assume they're going to die anyway. I've heard a lot of them say, I'm already dead. And these are the hardened Delta Force guys and stuff. I don't know how much of it is I don't know what they mean a lot by that, but it's an interesting mindset. You take on a different mindset, I guess. It's just, I don't know. I think
that's right. I think people have to. How do you kind of? You can't even imagine. How does anyone sort of mentally prepare for that? I presume you have to shut down.
I would imagine you're so close to death to begin with. If you're just hunting or even slaughtering an animal to eat, you haven't. The ancient world had a much more intimate, contact with death. just with blood, with just they saw it every single day in their animals, in their children. In the elderly, who were probably, by elderly, by the time they were 45, they were probably done.
Exactly. Look, I'd be a goner. I'm on my last legs.
There it is. So would I, my friend. So would I, although I look very young. Now, Hunter, yeah, exactly. Hunter was going to ask about child sacrifice.
Yeah, because you were saying about the value of life that we have for our children. Like the Carthaginians were apparently willing to sacrifice their children for religious purposes.
Babies,
yeah.
Nice guys.
Yeah, incinerating them. Look, there's been a massive debate about this, and it's still going on. The story is this: so Greek and Roman sources who tend to be very hostile towards the Carthaginians. What they write is they say Carthaginians in times of danger would sacrifice their children by burning them in a great fire. Now, of course, that's a very sort of, the Carthaginians are a Semitic people, and that's the whole idea of sacrificing firstborn children is a very Semitic idea. Just read the Bible.
Sure, the Old Testament,
it's there. It's sort of, something which sort of unites that whole sort of region. But so therefore, the big argument was people said, well, look, this is probably just not true. This is probably just propaganda. And then in the 19th century, they found basically this place called the Tophet in Carthage, which showed where they found lots of urns full of the charred remains of small children.
Nice. Happy times. Yeah.
But the argument isn't over because there are sort of two different camps here. There's a camp that say, look, these kids are already dead, okay, and they are being. The idea of doing your sacrifice is that you basically give your already dead children to the, you cremate them and you give them to the two main goddesses, the goddess Tanit and the god Baal. And then others say, no, these children actually are still are being killed. They are still alive. Now, I come down on the side of those that say that actually that some of these children were sacrificed. Not all the time. Some are already dead and some are sacrificed. So I'm sitting on the fence, basically.
Well, it wouldn't be a sacrifice unless they were already alive.
But basically the science, there's a chap called Schwartz who's in Pittsburgh, I think, and he's been doing a lot of scientific analysis, and he is pretty convinced that these children were, that child sacrifice was going on. Now, look, how are we going to put this into any context? Because actually, one of the things which meant that when people were deciding, when scholars in the 19th century were deciding who were going to be the good guys in the ancient world and who were going to be the bad guys, for a while especially in the 18th and 19th century, people were fascinated by Carthage and saw it as a great civilization. But as soon as they started thinking that people were sacrificing their own children, they were sort of cast out as being the sort of one of the sort of,
barbarian,
others.
Non-Christian sort of,
I mean, but if we turn this on its head and we say, well, look, you have got a big Roman army or Greek army camped outside your door, and it's looking like Armageddon is coming your way. And you understand that you need to sacrifice your most precious thing, the thing that is more precious to you than anything else. Then what's going to be more precious to you than your children?
That's right.
And so that, do you see, by turning that around mentally,
yeah,
you don't demonize them. You think, well, actually,
they're dead. They're dead anyway if they come in.
Yeah, no, right. Or even if they're not, you're giving the gods the biggest thing that you have.
Yeah,
and actually, and you think about the Bible, think about the story there. Mm-hmm. Is that Abraham and Isaac? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's so. In other words, I think we have to be. It's really hard. We have to be very careful about bringing our values back that far.
Sure,
because
sure.
In the end, everyone's going to be found wanting, aren't they?
Well, and by the way, take us through, and then I want to get into Hannibal. Take us through. You hear the story of salting the earth. I mean, did they really raise the place so that there was just nothing there, and then salt the earth, or is that more legend?
So that crops could never grow.
Disappointingly, they didn't salt the earth.
Damn it! Those humane Romans. Yeah.
Well, let down these Romans. Well, they talked a good game.
Yeah, I was going to say. All they did was burn a bunch of
50,000 people.
Enslave people.
There is in Carthage actually. There is if you're working as an archaeologist, obviously you're working with stratigraphy, which is a bit like looking layers of a cake. And in Carthage, there is a particular sort of layer, which is like this black tide mark, which is just full of sort of burnt bits and pieces, which is the destruction layer from Carthage from 146 BC.
Really?
So it's a sort of burnt, yeah. Wow. And they did, in the city centre, it does look like they demolished a lot of buildings and they burnt down a lot of it. But then what they do, about a century later, is they build a new city on top, and they build this sort of huge platform on top of the hill, and build on top of that. And so in some respects, that must have not only preserved some of the Punic city, but also destroyed other bits of it too. Mm-hmm. But in the outer lying areas, in the sort of suburbs, I think that actually they probably didn't destroy a lot of that. But the heart of the city, yes, they most definitely did, and they'd have had to have done that by hand. Yeah. There was no JCB to bring on site or something like that.
Right. Well, today's episode is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website or online portfolio. And for a free trial and 10% off, go to squarespace.com and use the offer code CALLAN8. Well, let's go to Hannibal because, as I read about, let's take Genghis Khan, Napoleon, even Alexander the Great, but probably less so. But let's just take Genghis Khan and Napoleon and these Roman leaders, Hannibal, these great generals and stuff who came in and wreaked havoc. I always, as I get older, I start to think, I think these guys were just sociopaths. They were just these narcissistic sociopaths they were just the biggest assholes on the planet who just decided that it was all about them and human beings were objects. So rather than being great generals, they were just willing to do horrific things. They probably were very charismatic and intelligent, but they were sociopaths. In other words, just huge assholes. And I mean, I'm being simplistic, but I'm also being honest about that. I always feel like these things are spurned on by some egomaniacal, sharp profile, charismatic profile like Hitler, and then the rest is history. I mean, they just leave nothing but a pile of ash behind.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's been all this research recently, hasn't there, on psychopaths and about how actually we tend to think of psychopaths all being in padded cells somewhere, in a sort of supermax or whatever, but they're not. They're actually running our banks.
Right.
Everything else. We're all on a scale of it, and actually we all need a bit of the inner psychopath to actually see.
There's a great self-help book there.
Yeah.
Channel your inner psychopath.
Channel your inner psychopath, exactly. But you're right. I mean, they don't have to be the ones killing you. They've done a lot of studies on. There's a book called The Psychopath Next Door, and she talks about how it doesn't mean he kills people. It just means that his only way to relate to other human beings is by winning and dominating over them, by controlling them.
He doesn't kill you. He sort of probably tries to poison your dog, or cut down your hedgerow or something like that.
Sure, and watch your reaction from afar. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But no, look. I think with these people, they've got to be giant egos to get thousands of men to basically follow you through, crossing the Alps by foot, as it's coming up towards winter, you've got to have something, haven't you?
Oh my God! Especially
let's fight in battle.
Let's bring these elephants with us while we're at it. I mean, is that myth or is that true? Did he really march elephants?
No, he took the elephants, but they all, again, disappointingly, they all died bar one of them.
Oh, is that right?
But, I mean, I'm presuming if you and I decided to set off with a load of elephants across the Alps, they might meet a sticky end.
I was going to say, unless you got very big blankets, because they don't have a lot of fur. And I hope you like elephant meat. Yeah.
But that one that made it across was really, really useful, right?
Yeah.
Sorry?
The one that made it across the Alps was really, really useful. A total game changer.
Yeah. So there was one that made the entire trip then.
No, it did. I mean, the one did. But elephants are they're more a psychological thing. They're like having like a massive tank,
right,
which sometimes works well, but a lot of the time breaks down. And so, in other words, they're very difficult to control. I mean, the problem with elephants in battle is they have no reverse gear. If they turn round, they'll just trample over you.
Yeah.
So, in other words, they're not really the best weapon. But psychologically, and it's the same thing as we talk about with Hannibal and with all these other great guys. They've half won the battle even before you get on the battlefield, because you're already thinking, oh my God, I'm now going to be facing Alexander or Napoleon or Hannibal. So what you're always trying to do is it's about the same thing as we do now, is that it's all about propaganda, about pushing a particular image of yourself to mean that, professional sports people, you must interview professional sports people.
Sure.
It's all mind games before the game, right?
Very much so.
And,
very much so,
half of it's won before you get on the field. One team already thinks they might lose, and the other one is confident they're going to win.
That's right.
And so a lot of this stuff is about not only being a skilled general in terms of tactics, also you've got to be really lucky, and sports people will tell you that as well.
Sure.
You need luck at the right moment. Events have got to conspire your way, but also it's about myth building all the time. So I'd say that the best way of thinking about some of these guys is to think about some of our elite coaches and sports people.
That makes a lot of sense. Field generals. I mean, I watch a lot of American football, and I think about that all the time. That's exactly what they're like. Yeah.
Oh, of course it is. It's the most subtle. If you're a Brit. When I first moved to the States, I was watching watching your football. It seemed to be sort of just go on and on and on. It's just me again.
You got to know what to look for, but that's so funny. We say the same thing about soccer, about your football.
Or cricket.
Yeah, oh my God.
A sport that takes a
change.
No,
says the Brit with the 3-day-long cricket matches. My God,
exactly. Man. Ashes are going on at the moment. Look, don't denigrate that. But it's that whole thing. But one of the things what you notice with football, and of course, I was in Madison, in Wisconsin, big football, and is how subtle. It's all in the mind, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's so subtle. This whole thing.
Well, it's a game.
It's so strategic.
It's a game of inches, and it's all strategic, man. Mm-hmm. It's all strategy. It is war. Those guys are tough, and they get injured, and it's everything. But it's a great deal of strategy. What do we know about Hannibal? What do we really know about him? What did he look like? Do we know what he looked like? Do we know?
We don't even know. All we know about him is he had a gammy eye.
He had a gammy eye. As in a lazy eye?
Yeah. Oh no, it's such a good word, isn't it? A lazy eye.
Lazy eye. A gammy eye.
He got ill. He got ill when he was marching through Italy. He got stuck in a swamp and he got some infection and eventually lost his eye.
Oh, I see.
But what does he look like? We don't. But the thing about Hannibal is that we always think about him as being a Carthaginian. He spent very little of his life in Carthage. He left there when he was 8 or 9 years old, and he only went back for a few years towards the end of his career. he is much more like Alexander the Great. So in other words, he's what I call a Hellenistic general. He's a general who basically, in some respects, he fits into a sort of mold of sort of being a sort of almost like a sort of a Greek Macedonian hero. And he plays that game all the time, being sort of presented, and he presents himself as being the new Hercules.
Well, he had that wonderful armor that you described, right? I mean, he had this. He was a theatrical man.
I mean, unfortunately, the Romans probably invented that armor, but it gives that sense in which, it's all about. It's as we go back to this. We go back to this point again. It's about how you present yourself. Everyone's they've got to believe in you, because there's a very good chance they're going to die. Your army, people are going to be killed in the most horrible way. They need to believe that you are a winner. If they think you're a loser, they'll just kill you anyway. Right. They'll kill you and go over to the other side or do whatever. So it's a precarious game.
But I've always wondered how a general, without microphones, without projecting himself on a big screen, how a general was able to motivate that many people with just his voice and his body from such a distance. I mean, I know you'd probably ride on your horse past your troops saying things, but there's a limit. I mean, I guess he created a legend by word of mouth, which can be even more powerful. It's the guy you don't see sometimes that's easier to build up than the guy you do see. Right?
You need a bit of mystique, don't you? If you think about, again, I mean, if you're going to be a sort of great leader, one of the things you don't want to do is you want people to think that you're sort of superhuman. You kind of don't want them seeing you eating breakfast with your wife, do you?
No, it's true. It's true.
The guy next door looks at it and goes, "Hey, you're exactly the same as me."
Right.
Right. And I mean, I know that slightly flies in the face of sort of watching the Kardashians or whatever else.
Yeah, but you're right. You're creating mystery.
But everything. Listen, I wouldn't follow Kim Kardashian into battle. Yeah,
I wouldn't follow Kim Kardashian either.
Which one, guys? Which one would you follow?
I might follow her into the bedroom. I'll tell you that. But that's just me.
But I think what these guys would do is, first of all, their commanders would be, their other commanders would basically be sort of geeing up their troops, but also it'd be more looking like you're wearing flash armor, and going up and down the line so people can see you. And this is one of the other things, is that the big game over in battles is if the general gets killed. And that's why the general's in the center, surrounded by crack troops, making sure that he doesn't fall. Well, because it's all of these battles, they're a complete confidence thing. So we go back to the sports analogy. The end, as soon as the confidence, you start losing that confidence, you're lost.
Did they use? Was it mostly swords and spears, or was it bows and arrows? Was it what kind of weaponry did they?
Use a range of different things. I mean, first of all, you'd have people throwing missile slings with sharpened stones in them. You'd have bows and arrows. You'd have javelin throwing, but then when you got in close, none of those things are useful. Then you're using whatever swords you had. And remember, in his army, you'd have a whole range of, you had a lot of people from all over the Mediterranean world, and so they'd all be using their own kit, which would be different.
Oh wow!
Different types of kit. Huh. So it depended who they were, and you'd have people who were just specialists, people who did certain things. So you'd have swordsmen. You would have those people who are spearmen. You might have archers. You'd have, as I said, slingshot throwers, all doing different things. But when you get in close, you need a short sword or a dagger or something like that. There's not much room to sort of swing something around.
Yeah. Well, go back to Hannibal being a Hellenistic. When you say that, a general, I think of Alexander the Great. In that Alexander the Great really was his tutor was Aristotle, and he would go in and say, "Look, you can keep what's here. You've just got to be loyal to me and we're going to change your educational system and things like that." But that's what I think of. So what do you mean by Hannibal being like Alexander the Great?
I think Alexander in the end is sort of modernizes warfare. He does it in a number of different ways, and I think the most important way is that if you looked at his staff that he took on his great march eastwards when he was conquering the Persian Empire, it wasn't just full in his camp. There weren't just generals and military strategists, but also historians, philosophers, all sorts of other writers. He brought his own PR machine with him. And again, so he understood the psychology of war far better. Look, I mean, but war originally, when it first, war had originally been a bit like we always think about Homer, don't we? We think about the sort of Achilles and Hector and this sort of idea of sort of individualized combat. Well, war wasn't like that at all. War was like an American football game without a ball. Actually, it was a lot of pushing and shoving, and actually not many people were killed.
Really?
Yeah, well, if you looked at sort of small, if you think about in Greece, think about the small city-states, when they weren't getting their harvest in, they'd go and fight each other. And it would be like a sort of, American football game between two townships. And not many people would be killed. Now, what you find with Alexander is that with the sort of invention of the syringe, his is a much more of a killing machine. So they have their phalanxes. The Macedonian phalanx is like a sort of watching a porcupine with these sarissas, these huge long pikes with sharp ends. And it'd be like a porcupine advancing forward. It was like a sort of bulldozer. Wow. And the idea of these pikes is to basically make sure that no enemies can get close to you.
Were they on horseback or were they walking?
No, these on foot.
Wow.
Okay, you'd have cavalry there as well. You'd sort of march forward. And then it's only later when you get in close, when you've got people to ground, that you can start killing them. That's where the killing zone is. But more than so, you have all of that sort of technology, all that sort of strategy, but more than anything, it's also about winning hearts and minds. It's about making people think that you are invincible. And so it's the cult of hero, the cult of personality. And Hannibal fits directly into that mold.
Was he surrendered to a great deal, or did people?
Yeah, no, he was. I mean, the reason why in the end he comes a cropper with losing against Rome is that he misunderstands the Romans, because the Romans are different, and the Romans are different because they do not have a reverse gear. They're like the elephants. In that, what happens with the Rome is that Hellenistic warfare works in a very simple way. What you do is you go and beat up your neighbor until such an extent that eventually they turn around and they sue for peace. And then you're on top and you get a good deal. His problem was this, is that he kept on getting the Romans into a sort of stranglehold, a sort of, in a position where he thinks that they will sue for peace. But they never do. They never do. They refuse to surrender. And fighting enemies that refuse to surrender is very, very difficult indeed.
Well, it exhausts you. It exhausts you, right?
It's exhausting. They just exhaust them out. And the Hellenistic world never get that right about Rome. And they also think, because Hellenistic kings, think about Alexander and others, it's all about, in the end, it's easy come, easy go. What you do is you might invade a bit of land, take it over, you exploit it. But if you need to trade it off for something else, you do. Easy come, easy go. With Romans, once they conquered a piece of territory, it becomes as Roman as Rome itself, and it's never to be surrendered. Wow! And so they're so difficult to fight against. And so Hannibal, in some respects, his problem in the end is that he does represent the old world. He represents the old Hellenistic world, whereas Rome is something new, and it takes them, and they never really get to grips with what Rome is about.
Well, it sounds as though that was because, I'm going to guess here, that Rome had, I suppose, a philosophy in which they could moor into, a bedrock, a strong, I guess, vision, a goal sheet even, or something where they had a plan, this Pax Romana, whatever you want to call it. They, as opposed to coming in just to conquer land, I suppose, to say you did it, they were actually working to build a real empire, to string together an entire world and to turn the world Roman. Is that the difference?
Well, I think in some respects, of course, when we think about empires are always we always start thinking about empires in hindsight. No one suddenly thinks I'm going to get an empire. They suddenly realize they have got one.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think what you find with Rome is that the Roman Empire was the greatest political enfranchising act ever. So what you have is that Romans gave you a choice. When they conquered you, there's a stark choice. Either we're going to kill you or you become Roman.
Right.
And if you think about the biggest disaster, think about a modern disaster, think about Iraq.
Right.
The biggest disaster, and if you speak to all these military guys, they'll tell you The biggest disaster was the practicing political decapitation in Iraq.
That's right.
It was the biggest trap disaster. This is because they got rid of everybody who was associated with Saddam, and there was no one left.
That's right.
They had no army. They had no police force. And they're still it was like a disaster, and they'll never do that again.
Right.
And what the Romans did was the opposite. The Romans left the leadership of those people they defeated in place. And they said, but now you're Romans, and you are doing this under our authority.
You'd think that we would learn from history. You'd think that the Bush administration would have learned from history in that sense.
We learned nothing from history.
Amazing.
This is why it's so interesting.
God.
And we just watch. They don't. And also you got to remember that you had one of the most supremely intellectually arrogant administrations ever.
That's for
sure.
sure.
That sounds a bit political. I mean, they didn't think anyone could tell them anything.
No, they didn't.
And there's one thing about, and one of the things about victory. And if you think about the sort of, the end of the Cold War, and you think about that sense in which sort of one side really come out on top, is victory makes you deaf. Okay, because all you hear is your own kind of, your own sort of your own sort of sense of sort of triumph. And I think that's what happened for a while, for a very short period of time. I think everybody in the West, we went deaf.
Well, mission accomplished, right? I mean, you saw.
Yeah, exactly. And now we've got to sort all this stuff out. And so I think with the Rome, there's a lot to learn from Rome. And it was just a fantastic system, because you can never hold territory through having a powerful army.
No,
ever.
No, you can't.
What you need is to integrate people into your system. And you would have thought, and if you think about what, America, which is, perhaps the most dynamic place on earth, is dynamic because it understood about making people American.
Well, and I mean, that's
and it's incredible. You go there, you come from abroad, and you go there. It's one of the things that you really, really notice is this sort of ethos of incorporation. And in some respects, Rome were fantastic at doing that as well, but on an even bigger scale.
Well, and I mean, consistently, when you look at the empires that succeed, they're very good at that. Alexander the Great was awesome at integrating local cultures. You are a historian, and if I tell me if I put you in charge, you are the historian in charge of of the Obama administration, and maybe the administration that comes after that. Where is the U.S. in your opinion going wrong? And we can lump the UK in there as well. Where is the West, the traditional powers of the West, and let's just call it in the past 50 years, the U.S., the UK. Where are we going wrong, and where should, in your opinion, and what do you think we should be careful of?
I think it's quite simple. I think firstly, stop the navel gazing about being in decline, because people have been predicting the decline of the West for about forever.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so therefore, and the rise of the rest. Well, let's just see how far they rise first.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone gets worried about what's going on in China, but the fact is that most of the sort of statistics they're basing it on are basically made up anyway.
That's right. That's exactly right.
What are we judging ourselves against?
Well, when was the last time you used it? When was the last time you drove a Chinese car or used a Chinese computer? I mean, the innovation in that country is nowhere close to what the U.S. is able to do. So
I just think confidence in that way, but at the same time, I think the lesson. Look, who am I to tell anybody anything? But I think fighting too many wars at the same time might not be such a good idea.
There you go.
And also deciding why you're fighting them.
Right.
Because again, one of the things that if you looked at Alexander and things, consistent message again and again and again. How many times have we heard different messages about why we're in Afghanistan? I don't know whether the American government is the same as the British government, but it seems to the message seems to change every week.
Of course.
You're thinking, and that's an issue. You need to know why you're doing this stuff, and you need to be able to communicate that.
Yeah.
And I think somewhere down the line, we kind of lost that one.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. We appreciate your time. And you're welcome anytime. I have to make a confession. I could listen to you talk all day. He's got that. I would abuse that accent. We're the ones with the accent, but I would abuse that. I mean, it's beautiful to listen to you speak. He's got that baritone voice. I'd love to. You could rob a bank in this country with that accent, my friend. You can just walk in and go, I'm sorry to bother you. Yes, go, sorry to bother you. I'm going to rob your bank now. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Then we can speak all the time. Can I speak to you in federal prison?
Exactly. You are correct. Richard Miles, Professor Richard Miles, we really appreciate your time, man.
Well, it's a pleasure, guys. Okay, have a good day.
We
You
will.
too.
Thanks for the book, man. We're going to put your book up on our website, and we'll be pumping it. So,
All right, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Cheers, then.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. That was awesome.
That was awesome.
Yet another enlightening show. No more comedy. It's just all academic shit. But if you want to learn something, you tune in to Bryan Callen and Hunter Motts and the Bryan Callen Show. I'm going to have to put Hunter Motts Show eventually.
No. It's the Bryan Callen Show.
I just like having you kind of being the guy who books all the guests, who comes up with all the ideas, and I take all the fucking credit.
You're the Hannibal.
That's it, man. That's it. Thanks for listening, guys.
You've been listening to The Bryan Callen Show. Be sure to visit bryancallen.com for information about this episode as well as past and future episodes. You can follow Bryan on Twitter at Bryan Callen and like him on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/Bryan Callen Comedy. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.